I was 3 hours outside of Nashville, the rain coming down in sheets that blurred the world into a grey smear, when the girl stumbled into the wash of my high beams. She looked like a ghost in a soaked sundress, her face pale enough to glow against the dark pines lining the shoulder. I slammed the air brakes, the rig groaning as the trailer hissed and shuddered to a halt just inches from her. She didn't scream or run. She just stood there, one hand clutching a blood-slicked shoulder, her eyes wide and hollow. I didn't think. I just threw the door open and hit the pavement. The moment my boots touched the mud, the air felt different, heavy with a copper tang that told me she wasn't just hurt, she was fading. I scooped her up, her weight barely more than a bundle of wet laundry, and as I turned back to the cab, a pair of headlights cut through the trees behind us, fast and predatory. I knew right then, as the gravel sprayed and the engine roared closer, that this wasn't an accident. I wasn't just a trucker anymore. I was the only thing standing between a dying girl and the person who had tried to put her in the ground. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain didn't just fall, it attacked. It hammered against the roof of the Peterbilt like 1,000 tiny ball bearings, the kind of weather that makes a man want to pull over and wait for morning. But as I settled the girl into the passenger seat, wrapping her in my spare flannel jacket, morning felt like a lifetime away. Her skin was ice cold. Every breath she took was a ragged wet sound that made my chest tighten. I didn't ask her name. I didn't ask what happened. I just saw the jagged, deep cut along her collarbone and the way her fingers were trembling as she tried to hold a piece of my old towel against the wound. "Stay with me, kid," I muttered, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. I checked my mirrors. Those headlights I'd seen in the woods weren't moving anymore. They were idling at the edge of the tree line, two glowing eyes watching us. I didn't wait for them to make a move. I jammed the shifter into gear and let the engine roar. The girl winced at the vibration, a small broken whimper escaping her blue-tinged lips. I kept one eye on the road and one on the rear view. I was heavy, 40 tons of steel and freight, but I knew every inch of this stretch of I-40. About 2 miles down, the headlights reappeared. They weren't just following, they were gaining. It was a blacked-out SUV, no plates, weaving through the minimal midnight traffic with a reckless desperation. My heart was a steady thrum in my ears, the old rhythm of the desert coming back to me. You don't survive 3 tours in the sandbox without learning how to read a pursuit. They wanted her back, and they didn't care about the witness in the driver's seat. I reached for the CB, but the airwaves were nothing but static and the distant chatter of guys hundreds of miles away. I was on my own. I looked over at the girl. She had closed her eyes, her head lolling against the headrest. "Hey, keep 'em open!" I barked, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Talk to me. Tell me your favorite color. Anything." "Blue," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tires. Like the ocean." "Good. Focus on that. We're going to get you to St. Jude's in the city. They've got the best people. You just have to hold on." The SUV surged forward, pulling alongside my trailer. I saw the passenger window roll down. In the flash of a lightning strike, I caught the glint of steel. A tire iron, a pipe. It didn't matter. They swerved inward, trying to pit maneuver a 40-ton rig. The impact shuddered through the frame. Most drivers would have panicked, slammed the brakes, and jackknifed. I isn't most drivers. I gripped the wheel, counter-steering into the hit. I felt the resistance, the metal-on-metal scream as my lug nuts chewed into their quarter panel. I didn't give them an inch. I shifted down, letting the engine brake roar, and then slammed the accelerator. The sudden surge of torque caught them off guard. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, using the weight of the trailer to swat them like a fly. The SUV fishtailed, tires screaming on the wet asphalt before sliding into the grassy median. I didn't stop to see if they were okay. I had 15 minutes to get this girl to an ER, or she was going to bleed out in my cab. As I crested the hill and saw the lights of the city flickering through the storm, I felt the first real spike of adrenaline. The girl's hand went limp in mine. I pushed the Peterbilt harder than I ever had, the needle climbing past 80, the whole rig vibrating as if it were about to shake itself apart. I wasn't just driving a truck, I was driving a shield, and I wasn't letting anyone through it. The ER waiting room was a sea of startled faces, but I didn't have time for their shock. I felt the adrenaline singing in my veins, that sharp electric hum that usually only comes when a situation has gone completely sideways. The two men in suits were moving fast, their expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. They weren't just angry, they were panicked. That told me everything I needed to know. People only get that kind of desperate when they're about to lose something they can't afford to let go of. "Stay back," the taller guard ordered, placing a hand on my chest. He was young, his uniform still crisp, and he made the mistake of underestimating the man underneath the grease-stained denim. He saw an old trucker who should have been exhausted from the road. He didn't see the decades of muscle memory or the way my weight was centered, ready for the first sign of a reach. "You don't understand," the first suit shouted, his voice cracking with a manufactured authority. "That girl is a ward of the state under our protection. This man snatched her from a transport site. He's dangerous." The lie was smooth, practiced. It was the kind of strategic shift that changes the air in the room. I saw the security guard's eyes harden. They weren't looking at a hero anymore. They were looking at a predator. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just watched the suits. The one doing the talking had a bruise forming on his temple, likely from when I swatted their SUV off the road, and his partner was reaching into his jacket pocket. "He's got a weapon!" the partner yelled, pointing at me. It was a setup, a blatant lie to get the guards to take me down so they could slip into the back and finish what they started in the woods. The younger guard lunged for my arm, reaching for his cuffs, but he was moving in slow motion compared to the world I was living in. I didn't want to hurt him. He was just a kid doing a job, but he was in the way of justice. I stepped inside his reach, my forearm meeting his bicep to kill the momentum of his grab. With a fluid pivot, I used his own energy to guide him past me, my other hand catching the back of his tactical vest, just enough to keep him from hitting the floor face first. It wasn't a fight. It was a redirection. The second guard pulled his baton, the telescopic metal snapping open with a lethal clack. He swung high, a desperate move. I ducked, the air from the swing whistling over my cap, and drove my shoulder into his midsection. We hit the wall together, the framed mission statement of the hospital shattering behind him. I didn't let him recover. I pinned his arm, the baton dropping to the tile with a hollow ring, and I leaned in close to his ear. "Look at their shoes," I whispered, my voice a low, vibrating growl. "Look at the mud on their trousers. They didn't come from an office. They came from the woods where I found that girl bleeding out." The guard froze, his eyes darting to the suits. They were backing toward the exit now, realizing the physical confrontation wasn't going their way. They had underestimated the fat trucker, and now the strategic situation had suffered an irreversible change. "Call the police," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear as I let the guard go. "And tell them to bring a forensics kit for the black SUV in the parking lot." My dashcam caught every second of them trying to run me off the road while that girl was screaming in the seat next to me. The main suit's face went from pale to ghostly. He looked at the door, then at me, then at the shattered glass on the floor. He knew the silent witness on my windshield had already ended his career. He tried to bolt, but I was already moving. I wasn't letting them leave this building until the girl was safe, and the truth was pinned to the wall. I cut off his path to the door, my boots heavy and rhythmic on the tile. He tried to swing a wild, panicked punch, but I caught his wrist mid-air. I didn't squeeze hard, not yet, but I let him feel the strength of a man who spent his life pulling gears and hauling the weight of the world. "You picked the wrong truck tonight," I told him, the words landing like stones in a still pond. The suit's wrist felt thin in my grip, like a dry branch ready to snap. He was hyperventilating now, the smell of expensive cologne and cheap fear rolling off him in waves. His partner stood paralyzed by the vending machines, his eyes darting toward the sliding doors, measuring the distance, calculating the risk. But the room had shifted. The air was thick with the realization that the man standing in front of them wasn't just a witness. He was a wall. "Let me go," the suit hissed, his voice trembling as he tried to regain some shred of his earlier bravado. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. There are people who make guys like you disappear for less than this." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I just tightened my grip, the slow, steady pressure making him drop to his knees. I wasn't doing it out of malice. I was doing it because the strategic situation required restraint. If he moved, he was a threat to the staff. If he stayed, he was evidence. The younger security guard I'd bypassed earlier was back on his feet, but he wasn't reaching for his belt anymore. He was watching the suit's shoes, then looking at the muddy, torn hem of the man's trousers, just like I told him to. "He's right," the guard muttered, his voice gaining a hard edge as he pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, I need a priority police response at the ER entrance. We have a suspected kidnapping and a vehicular assault. And notify the ICU. The girl that just came in is a crime victim, not a patient. The partner by the vending machine saw his window closing. He didn't try to save his friend. He turned and bolted for the exit, his feet skidding on the polished floor. I didn't chase him. I didn't have to. Stay with this one, I told the guard, shoving the kneeling suit toward him. I stepped out of the lobby and back into the rain. The storm was still howling, the wind whipping the hospital's flags into a frenzy. My Peterbilt sat idling at the curb, its chrome grille glowing under the amber streetlights, the engine a low, rhythmic thrum that felt like my own heartbeat. I reached into the cab, my fingers finding the small, rugged housing of my dashcam. I popped the SD card out. This was the silent witness, the receipts that didn't lie. As I turned back, the partner was fumbling with the door of the mangled SUV. He managed to get it open, but as he shifted into reverse, I was already there. I didn't use a weapon. I didn't need one. I used the environment. I grabbed a heavy metal trash receptacle from the sidewalk and jammed it into the gap between his open door and the frame. He slammed the accelerator, and the door caught the metal, shrieking as it was wrenched backward, pinning him into the driver's seat. He was trapped, his legs tangled in the steering column, the engine screaming as the tires spun uselessly on the wet pavement. I walked up to the window, the rain dripping off the brim of my cap, and looked him dead in the eye. "The girl," I said, my voice barely a whisper over the roar of the wind. "Who is she?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me with a mixture of hatred and pure, unadulterated terror. He looked past me, his eyes widening. I turned my head. 3 police cruisers were screaming into the parking lot, their blue and red lights reflecting off the puddles in a chaotic strobe. The officers moved with practiced precision, their boots splashing as they surrounded the SUV. I stepped back, holding the SD card up in the air where they could see it. I didn't want any more misunderstandings. "Officer?" I called out as the lead sergeant approached, his hand resting on his holster. "I'm the driver of the rig. The girl is inside. These 2 tried to kill her, and then they tried to kill me to get her back. It's all on the card." The sergeant looked at the mangled SUV, then at my truck, then at the man pinned by the trash can. He took the card from my hand, his expression unreadable. "We'll see," he said. "In the meantime, don't go anywhere. We're going to need a statement." I nodded and leaned against the fender of my Peterbilt. The adrenaline was starting to recede, replaced by a deep, bone-weary ache. I watched as they dragged the partner out of the SUV and led the first suit out of the lobby in handcuffs. They looked small now, diminished by the light of the truth. But as the police began their work, a tall, grey-haired man in a white lab coat stepped out of the ER doors. He looked exhausted, his surgical mask hanging around his neck. He scanned the parking lot until his eyes landed on me. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the suspects. He walked straight toward the Peterbilt. "Are you the one who brought her in?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I am," I said, straightening up. "How is she?" The doctor didn't answer immediately. He looked at the blood on my flannel jacket, then at the red line tattoo on my forearm that was peeking out from my rolled-up sleeve. He froze. His eyes drifted from the ink to my face, and for a second, the world seemed to stop spinning. "Mercer," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Jack Mercer, from the 10th Mountain." I felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the rain. I looked at him closer, trying to find a familiar feature in the map of wrinkles on his face. "Do I know you, Doc?" He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a long moment, the rain soaking his hair, before he slowly raised his hand to his brow and delivered a crisp, silent salute. "You don't remember me," he said, his voice trembling. "But I remember you. Kandahar, the convoy ambush in '09. I was the medic you carried 3 miles through the sand after the Humvee hit the IED. You didn't stop until we hit the wire." The memories hit me like a physical blow. The heat, the smell of burning rubber, the weight of a man on my shoulders. I hadn't thought about that day in years. I'd spent a long time trying to forget it. "Doc," I breathed, the recognition finally clicking into place. "She's going to make it, Jack," he said, his eyes glistening. "But we just ran her prints. Do you have any idea who that little girl is?" I shook my head, my throat suddenly too tight to speak. "She's been missing for 3 years, the doctor said, looking back at the hospital doors. "She's the daughter of Senator Miller. Those men weren't state workers, they were the ones who took her." The silence that fell over the parking lot then was heavier than the storm. The police stopped talking. The suspects stopped struggling. Even the wind seemed to die down. I looked at my hands, still stained with her blood, and then at the rig that had carried us through the dark. I wasn't just a trucker hauling freight anymore. I was a man who had finally finished a mission I didn't even know I was on. The hospital lobby was no longer a place of healing. It had become a tactical bottleneck. As the first suit was being led away in cuffs, I noticed a second black SUV, identical to the first, sliding into the far end of the parking lot with its lights off. These weren't just 2 desperate kidnappers. This was a coordinated recovery team. I felt that old, familiar prickle at the base of my neck, the one that used to keep me alive in the mountain passes of Afghanistan. The lead agent who had approached me, the woman with the sharp eyes, caught me looking. She didn't have time to react before the glass of the front entrance shattered. It wasn't a bullet, it was a flashbang. The world turned white. A high-pitched scream echoed in my ears, and the smell of magnesium filled the air. Most people in the lobby hit the floor, clutching their heads, but my body moved on instinct. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the heavy security desk. I grabbed the younger guard by his vest and hauled him behind the oak counter, just as a burst of suppressed fire chewed into the drywall where he'd been standing. "Stay down," I growled, my voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. 2 men in tactical grey moved through the smoke, their movements professional, tight and lethal. They weren't looking for me. They were heading for the ICU doors where the girl had just been taken. They were here to silence the witness. I looked at the guard's dropped baton on the floor. It was a piece of cold steel, but in the right hands it was a lever. I didn't have a sidearm, but I had 40 years of manual labor and 3 tours of combat experience. I stayed low, moving through the haze of the fire suppressant system. One of the tactical shooters slowed down to check a corner. He was good, but he was focused on the rooms, not the shadows. I came out of the dark like a freight train hitting a stalled car. I didn't trade punches. I drove my shoulder into his kidney, felt the air leave his lungs, and used his own momentum to slam his head into the doorframe. He went down hard, his rifle clattering across the tile. I didn't pick up the gun. If I started shooting, the police outside would think I was part of the hit team. I grabbed the shooter by the collar and dragged him into a supply closet, kicking his legs out from under him and zip-tying his hands with a heavy-duty plastic tie from my own pocket. The second shooter heard the scuffle and spun around, raising his weapon. I was already moving, sliding across the blood-slicked floor. I kicked a heavy gurney into his path, the metal frame catching him in the shins and sending him stumbling back. Before he could level his barrel, I was on him. I caught his wrist, twisting it until I heard the joint pop, and delivered a short, brutal palm strike to his chin. His head snapped back, his eyes rolling into his skull. I caught him before he hit the floor to keep the noise down. 2 down. But I knew there were more outside, and the police were still disoriented by the chaos in the lobby. I looked through the small glass window of the ICU doors. The doctor, my old medic, was standing over the girl's bed, his back to the door, oblivious to the war that had just broken out 20 feet away. I realized then that my dashcam wasn't the only thing that was going to save this girl. I was the only physical barrier left between her and a professional hit squad. I stood up, wiping the sweat and smoke from my eyes, and braced myself against the door. "Come and get it," I whispered to the empty hallway. The silence in the ICU hallway was thick enough to choke on, broken only by the distant, muffled chaos of the lobby and the rhythmic electronic chirping of the heart monitors behind me. I stood my ground at the double doors, my shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. I wasn't just a truck driver anymore. I was a physical obstruction, a strategic change in the situation that could not be undone. I knew the rhythm of these operations. The first wave was the distraction, the second was the surgical strike. They thought they were coming for a defenseless child, but they hadn't accounted for 40 tons of resolve standing in the way. The lights flickered as the hospital's backup generators kicked in, casting the hallway in a sickly, strobing orange. At the far end of the corridor, 3 silhouettes emerged from the service stairwell. They weren't fumbling or shouting. They moved with the silent, predatory grace of men who had done this 100 times in 100 different dark corners of the world. They were wearing tactical vests with no patches, their faces obscured by balaclavas. These were the ghosts, the ones who disappear people. "Jack!" The doctor's voice came from behind the ICU glass, trembling but sharp. "What's happening?" "Stay on the floor, Doc," I said, not turning my head. "Keep your hands on that girl and don't look up until I tell you." The lead man in the hallway raised a hand, signaling his team to spread out. They didn't bother with words. They saw an old man in a blood-stained jacket and figured I was just a casualty they hadn't counted yet. They were wrong. I felt the weight of my own history settle into my shoulders. The miles I'd walked, the weights I'd lifted, and the men I'd broken when they tried to cross a line they shouldn't have. The first man lunged, closing the distance with a speed that would have caught a normal civilian off guard. He went for a combat knife tucked into his chest rig. I didn't wait for him to draw it. I stepped into his space, my boot connecting with his lead knee with a sickening pop. As he buckled, I seized his head, driving my palm into his nose, feeling the cartilage shatter. It wasn't about style, it was about kinetic energy and immediate incapacitation. The second man was already on me, swinging a heavy, shortened baton. I took the hit on my shoulder, a dull, radiating ache, but I used the contact to trap his arm. I pivoted, my center of gravity low, and executed a hip throw that sent him crashing through a plastic partition. The sound of breaking acrylic echoed like a gunshot. I didn't give him a chance to breathe. I followed him down, delivering a short arc elbow to his temple that turned his lights out instantly. The third man, the leader, stopped. He leveled a suppressed handgun at my chest. His eyes were cold, professional, and entirely focused. "Move!" he commanded, his voice a raspy whisper. "You've done enough, old man. This isn't your fight." "You picked the wrong truck tonight," I told him, mirroring the words I'd given his partner in the lobby. I could hear the sirens outside getting louder, but I knew the police were still clearing the lobby. I was on an island. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. In that split second, the fire alarm system finally triggered, and the overhead sprinklers roared to life. A curtain of cold, heavy water slammed down between us, blurring the air. I didn't move away. I moved through the spray. He fired once, the round whistling past my ear and shattering the glass of the ICU door behind me. I didn't give him a second shot. I reached through the water, my hand closing around the barrel of the gun, twisting it upward as it discharged again into the ceiling. I drove my forehead into his face, a mountain man's greeting. He staggered back, his vision swimming. I followed through with a series of heavy, rhythmic strikes to his midsection. feeling the air leave him. I finished it by grabbing him by the vest and launching him headfirst into the metal frame of the medication cart. He went limp before he hit the floor. I stood there in the downpour of the sprinklers, my chest heaving, the water washing the blood and soot from my skin. I looked down at the 3 men scattered like cordwood in the hall. They were restrained by their own equipment, their professional mission ended by a man who had simply refused to move. The ICU door creaked open behind me. The doctor stepped out, his white coat soaked, looking at the carnage in the hallway with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Jack," he breathed, looking at me as if he were seeing a ghost from the desert. "You're still that man. You haven't changed a bit." "Check the girl," I said, my voice a gravelly rasp. "I'm not going anywhere." I leaned against the wall, watching the end of the hallway, as the first team of real federal marshals finally burst through the stairwell, their tactical lights cutting through the mist and the dark. The girl was safe. The silence was back, but this time it was the silence of a battle won. The water from the sprinklers was already starting to pool around my boots. A cold, steady rain that felt like the highway followed me inside. I watched the federal marshals swarm the hallway, their heavy footsteps splashing as they moved past me to secure the 3 men I'd laid out on the tile. The adrenaline was leaving my system now, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in my shoulder where the baton had connected, but I didn't let my knees buckle. I stayed standing, a pillar of grease and denim in a world of high-tech gear and sterile white walls. "Clear! All threats neutralized!" the marshal leader shouted, his voice echoing off the wet walls. He looked at me, then at the men I'd disarmed with nothing but my hands and a sheer refusal to move. He didn't ask for my name. He just gave me a solemn nod of respect. I turned back to the ICU glass. The doctor was already back at the girl's side, his hands steady as he adjusted her IV. She looked smaller than she had in my truck. A fragile thing that had somehow survived a nightmare that would have broken grown men. The realization of who she was, Senator Miller's daughter, was finally settling in. It wasn't about the politics or the headlines for me. It was about the 3 years she'd spent in the dark and the fact that tonight she was finally going to wake up in a world that knew her name. "Jack," the doctor said, stepping out of the room once the marshals had established a perimeter. He wiped a smudge of blood from his forehead. "The senator's security detail is 5 minutes out. They're bringing a specialist team. You should probably go before the news crews turn this parking lot into a circus." I nodded. I wasn't looking for a medal or a spot on the evening news. I had a trailer full of medical supplies that needed to be in Nashville by dawn, and my Peterbilt was sitting at the curb with the lights still humming. I walked back through the lobby, my boots squeaking on the linoleum. The police were finishing the cleanup, and the first suit I'd confronted was being loaded into a cruiser, his face a mask of humiliated rage. I stopped at the exit, looking at the silent witness on my dashcam one last time as I climbed into the cab. The footage was the final nail in the coffin for the men who had tried to steal a child's future. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a clean shirt, shivering as the heater finally started to fight back the damp chill in my bones. Just as I was about to release the air brakes, a black SUV, one of the real ones this time, pulled up alongside the rig. The window rolled down, and a man with eyes that had seen too much grief looked up at me. He didn't say a word. He just placed a hand over his heart and lowered his head in a quiet, profound gesture of gratitude. I gave him a single short nod and shifted the heavy transmission into gear. The rain had turned into a light mist as I pulled out of the hospital lot, the city's neon lights reflecting off the wet chrome of my mirrors. I felt the weight of the night settling into my muscles, but for the first time in a long time, the road ahead didn't feel quite so lonely. I reached over and tapped the dashboard, a habit of mine when the rig had done its job well. "We're moving, kid," I whispered to the empty passenger seat where she'd sat just hours ago. "You're going home." I pushed the Peterbilt into the dark, the engine's roar the only sound in the quiet cab as the hospital faded into the distance behind me. The road stretches out ahead of me, a long ribbon of black velvet cutting through the dissipating fog. The cab of the Peterbilt is warm now, the steady hum of the diesel engine acting as a balm for the chaos that unfolded back at the hospital. I keep my eyes on the white lines, watching them zip past like the years I left behind in the desert. My shoulder throbs where that baton caught me, a sharp reminder that while I'm older, the world hasn't gotten any softer. I reach over and touch the passenger seat. It's still damp from her dress. I can still see her face in the shadows of the dashboard, the way her eyes looked when she finally realized she wasn't alone in that storm. I've hauled a lot of freight in my time, steel, timber, fuel, but nothing ever weighed as much as that little girl did when I picked her up out of the mud. The doctor's salute stays with me, a ghost of a life I thought I'd buried. It's funny how the road brings you back to yourself, whether you're ready for it or not. I don't feel like a hero. I just feel like a man who did what needed to be done because nobody else was there to do it. As the sun begins to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, I pull into a quiet rest stop to finally change out of my blood-stained shirt. I catch my reflection in the side mirror, eyes tired, face lined with the miles, and I think about that girl waking up with her father by her side. For a guy like me, that's the only paycheck that matters. I climb back into the driver's seat, release the brakes with a familiar hiss, and merge back into the flow of the morning traffic. I've still got 300 miles to go, and the road doesn't wait for anyone. Thank you for watching. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.